Hey there, this video is intended to be a quick walkthrough of the new Snowflake Dashboard version 5 that we have put out. You'll notice that there's a few differences in screens, but most of the stuff looks the same. There's a starting menu on our table of contents. These screens haven't changed a whole lot. Just as before, you're able to choose what parameters you want, and those things will get visualized in your charts. All that's kind of the same as what it was before. Still have the ability to audit and see the security dashboard. The biggest difference was the addition of the query performance analytics directly within the app. In version 4, we completely changed things and started aggregating the query performance statistics, and then used on-demand application generation to actually get you into an app to see this stuff. Instead, what we've done now is brought everything back into it, and you'll see when I show you the load script, there's a few changes to be able to sustain that. The numbers had just gotten so big for so many people. We had went to that aggregated model, and yet so many others have a simple solution, or say, hey, we only need 30 or 60 or 90 days worth of data. We don't want to have to deal with having on-demand and understanding and supporting that. So this version, it's all right there. The one big addition has been the ability to call Snowflake's query performance stats function. And so what I mean by that, we are able to select a query. We can always, like always, see what the query was. And you can go get the query performance statistics on the fly for that. And what we do is then we visually depict exactly what the execution plan was. If there are any of these things that are known issues that occurred, those things would be shown. So I'm going to change this and use this really big query. And by the way, this really big query that took 7 hours and did 4 trillion bytes worth of storage, that was done intentionally wrong to create the nightmare mess and be able to show you here's all of the really bad things that occurred in that query. Any of the execution plan portions that had issues are going to be shown up in orange there. And for any of these things, you're able to just simply click and it'll take you right to the Snowflake documentation as to how you would fix that. So that's pretty much the biggest change that's been in the application. I'm going to go ahead and go to the load editor and give you a quick rundown as far as how you would configure this thing. So like always, we've got all the documentation from the very first time David Frericks created the app to the multiple versions we've gone through. The biggest information here is that in version 5, there is no incremental loading. So you do not have to worry about live and backup and having QVD files sitting around. Of course, what that means is if you are a big organization and you have multiple tenants and you do want to keep data for years, you should still use version 4.0. Absolutely should still use version 4.0. That's going to be a much better fit for you. But if you were one of those, hey, we just don't have the developers on staff to understand what ODAG is or to understand really how to configure, keeping these QVDs around, fantastic. With version 5, it is going to load all the data every time you load. And so as part of that, what we've done is we've implemented a get me the last X days of data so that you could define how much data you really want to go with. And again, this is intended for those that they're not looking for years of history. They're not really trying to track it that way. They're looking and they know that they're up to speed on things. They're not trying to find a developer who did something wrong 2 years ago. They're looking at things much fresher. And so I'm going to show you where that loaded particular days is. One of the things that we found out was as we were reading query history, you don't always see the user app names. And we track and we track and we realize, oh, wait, Snowflake tells us in their documentation that the session information is not always up to date. It's kind of batched in the area that we call to pull those sessions. So there's going to always be some delay. So you will always, if you're active, find some queries that are brand new that do not have a correlated session with those. So you would not see the user. Don't panic. Those things, as you keep refreshing, those things will be there. Just we wanted to call that out and make sure that you were aware of that. The other thing is based on the time to load. If you are somebody who does not care to be able to track the databases, tables, and columns that are there, you do not have to. All you would do is you would come down to these sections and you could just manually move those sections down below the exit script so that they're not loaded. And then you can clean up your data model and not have to worry about those things. But there are others who love seeing the databases screen and can see how many columns are out there, how many tables are out there, so that they could perhaps see stuff and decide whether or not they want to clean up their Snowflake models. So back to trying to configure. We still have this variable for Windows or SAS as it's used for something else. But don't worry about where you're about actually being QVDs. That's not what this value is set for. But now what we do is we set this max query time. And you're telling me how many days before right now you want to use. So if I want 14 days rolling, I would use minus 13. If I want a year, I could use 364. I could use 89 to get a 90-day going there. So always remember that today counts as a day, and you're trying to go back X amount of days. That is completely up to you. If you have 15 instances and you have millions of transactions being run every day, you probably would not want to use this version again. Because you will be pulling everything live. For our environments, this was a realistic number for us, and it could go larger. It's just, again, everything is being pulled live in this version, and you may not want that. So this main variables is where you set the defaults for number of days, and again, it's going to start at 14. So if you get this and just run it, don't be surprised if you're only seeing 2 weeks worth of history. That's the purpose. This section here for Snowflake instances is where you reload and give it this table name for Snowflake instances. This is just a name. This is the name that you will see for the connection in the application. And this is the literal name for the connection string. And so here, this is pulling this SFPE. It's using the Snowflake connector. There is no pathing to that. You'll see it's not here. That connector is actually in my personal information. If I have another name here with a colon, it's telling me this is the space that connection is pulled out of. If you actually created the connections in the same space you're running this app in, you would just use those connection names. So these are the names. And what's going to happen is when it reads that, it's going to try to connect to that library. So if you're familiar with connection strings, that's what's happening there. So again, you simply control these things. You can add as many as you want. If you only have one instance, take this one out and just change that. Just like in the previous instances, you tell us which connection is what type, whether it's a partner, whether it's prepaid, however you figure that out, what your costs are. You implement that information here, and then that's what's going to get used inside of the application. So what your costs are, and you're going to implement these. These are just the defaults that come out of the box. You'll notice it says if is partial reload. These are sections because what happens for that, if you ask for a query to come back, it's a partial reload. And it's going to come in, it's going to go to those other sections and say, ignore this. This is a partial reload. You do not need to iterate through Snowflake instances right now. And then when it gets to this section, it's going to say, yes, I am a partial reload. I want you to go get the query stats from this Snowflake get query operator stats function. And then all of that data is brought back. If you do not need this partial reload, notice at the bottom of this, there's an else, because everything else through here is set up to expect it to be the full reload. So if you yank this section, then understand that down here later on, you will have to go back and end the if, or take that if out of there. And you can even, if you're aware of these things, you know, hey, you can just change this to a normal load instead of an add load. So those are really the big changes to version 5. Everything else should be the same. As always, don't hesitate to send questions to Dave Frericks or I as you start playing with this version. Have a great day.